Hello everybody, this is Karambasgirl018, and this is going to be Chapter 5, Part 1 of Reading of the Stolen Throne. Let's begin. Logain glanced uncomfortably at the knights who had been assigned to his command, once again wondering just how he had allowed himself to end up here. 30 mounted men in heavy plate armor, each with more combat experience in the last year than he had had in his whole life, and he was supposed to lead them? It served him right for suggesting a plan in the first place. If he had been smart, he would have kept his full mouth shut after that and had been on his way. But the more Logain had listened to Arl Rendorn and Marek argue about who would play the most important role in the plan, the more irritated he had become. Finally, he'd thrown his hands up in disgust and volunteered to play the role himself, if only to give the two of them to start arguing. Marek thought the idea a brilliant one. That really should have told Logain right then that the whole enterprise was doomed to failure. Even so, there he was, ready to play his part. Logain wore a fine linen shirt, shining boots, and a helmet to hide his black hair. His heavy purple cloak had once belonged to the Rebel Queen, a signature garment he felt awkward wearing. The leathers he wore were lined with black velvet and almost too tight to wear, but they were the only trousers Marek owned that would fit. He had never worn such expensive, impractical clothing in his life, but it was necessary. Logain and the knights kept their horses calm, staying in the middle of a shallow stream as they waited for the enemy to arrive. The scouts Arl Rendorn had sent out reported the bulk of the force approaching from the east would come this way, and that they would see the enemy coming out of the trees along the stream's bank. Logain planned to make them believe they saw Prince Marek fleeing his army, escorted by a small unit of his fastest and most heavily armed knights. To pass as Marek, Logain figured he just needed to look important from a distance. With any luck, the enemy would see the purple cloak and his finery and assume that Arl Rendorn was doing exactly what he had intended to do: send Marek to safety. So Logain's plan was to draw the eastern part of the attacking army away. Then the bulk of the rebel army would be able to deal with the northern attackers without also getting attacked from behind. Smart plan. And after that, well, Logain hoped they would be in position to come to his rescue, because he would need one without question. And that was assuming everything went according to plan, which, as his father had always said, was unheard of in any battle. How did I end up here? He asked himself. The truth was that he had no good answer. It was quiet, except for the gentle barbling of the stream as it flowed past, and the occasional nervous nickering of one of the horses. A breeze rustled the nearby trees gently, and Logain breathed deeply, taking in the smell of pine and fresh water. He felt oddly at peace. The imminent battle seemed very far away indeed. Some of the knights kept glancing his way, their uncertainty about him noticeable despite their efforts to keep it hidden. They had to wonder who he was, Logain thought. There had been little time for introductions, barely any chance to explain what was in store. The Arl had called for volunteers from among his most experienced men, and here they were. Volunteers, they were told, because the chances that none of them might make it back were quite high. Why did he think this was a good plan, exactly? One of the knights leaned toward him, an older fellow with a bushy gray mustache showing inside his helmet. "This place we're to ride to," he asked, quietly. "Do you know of it, Sir Logain?" "No need for the title. It's just Logain." The knight seemed surprised, but His Grace said that your father... "I suppose he was. I, however, am not." Logain looked at the man curiously. "Does that bother you? Being led by a commoner?" The knight glanced at several of his fellows, who had been listening to their exchange. He looked back at Logain, shaking his head firmly. "If this plan will truly see Prince Marek safe," he stated, "then I would gladly follow my own enemy into battle. I will give my life if need be." "As would I," said another much younger knight. Others nodded their assent. Logain looked around at them, marveling at their determination. Perhaps their chances were not so bad after all. "I have been through this area once before," he told them. "Down this stream to the south, across the ridge and a plain, there's a bluff. A cliff with a broad and sharp face. It has a single narrow path leading up its side." "I know of it," one of the other men called out. "When we get there, we ride up that path as fast as possible. There is a flat area up there that is defensible. If we can defend the path, we can hold it." "But," the same man said uncertainly, "the rocks behind it are too steep. There's no way out of there." Logain nodded. "No, there isn't." He let that sink in. Logain was guessing the enemy would want what they thought was the prince badly enough that they wouldn't just give up and ride back to attack the rest of the rebel force. so he and the Earl's volunteers had to make this look good. Gradually, the murmuring among the men quieted, and they returned to waiting for the enemy to show their faces. There was nothing else they could do, after all. Fortunately, it didn't take long. When the first soldier poked his head out of the trees, Logan unleashed an arrow. He hit the man in the shoulder when he could just as easily have taken him in the throat, since he wanted the man to run in panic, and he did. More soldiers followed within moments. Many of the knights around Logan were armed as he was, and the twang of bowstrings was followed by men shouting in pain and falling. The horses stomped nervously in the water, backing away from the bank. Now the counterattack began, as the enemy realized what was awaiting them. Rather than charging blindly out of the trees onto the bank, they began assembling just inside of cover. The din of many feet and shouts resounded through the forest like an approaching storm. As arrows drilled through the air toward them, the knights raised their shields against the angry torrent. "Your Highness," one of the knights bellowed loudly towards Logan, "we need to get you to safety." "Protect the prince," another shouted. "South!" Logan raised his sword up high. "Follow me!" And then with that he turned and sped his horse to the south, splashing water loudly as the other knights followed suit. Even above it all, however, Logan heard cries from the enemy of, "It's the prince!" and louder cries of, "After them!" More arrows streaked by, a hornet swarm of angry projectiles that began to come faster and faster as Logan and the knights raced down the stream. The purple cloak billowed in his wake. One of the men directly behind him shouted out in pain and fell from his horse, splashing awkwardly in the stream. Racing for their lives, the other knights could do nothing but leap over him or go around. The water was just high enough to slow them. They didn't want to go too fast. They wanted the enemy to see them and pursue, after all. But the arrows were coming in too great a volume. The sight of the mass of men behind them was growing too quickly. What if the scouts' estimates had been wrong? "Faster!" Logan cried. Another man fell, screaming, as they reached the ridge. Here the stream turned, and a steep embankment had formed. Logan raced up the side, urging his horse to greater exertions as the arrows sang by his ear. For a moment his mount struggled and slowed jarringly on the way to the ridge, and then almost painfully reached the top and leaped forward. "Follow me!" Logan shouted to the men behind him. Like a wave crashing against a wall, they surged up the side of the ridge. The water turned under their hooves as the horses struggled, and not far behind them the enemy spilled out of the forest and into the stream in hot pursuit. They had no riders of their own, thankfully, but they were hardly slow. Now that they were in the open, they could move more rapidly. Whipping his horse almost until it bled, Logan led the charge across the open plain. The bluff was in sight, a long cliff along the edge of the rockier hills that marked the southern tip of the valley. He saw the path they needed as well, and at the same time spotted a group of enemy soldiers coming out of the trees ahead. They were scouts, he assumed, or were part of the enemy's broader lines. They were in heavy leathers and moderately armed and spun about to face the approaching line. Well, Logan thought, if they truly intend to stand in the way of charging horses, best give them what they deserve. He let a cry of attack, raising his blade once again, and sped directly toward the enemy. The knights responded to his cry and followed. There was a thunder of hooves and war cries as they landed with full force upon the soldiers. For a moment it seemed to Logan as if time moved at a crawl. He watched the horror dawning on their faces, saw how some of them in the back scrambled too late to get back into the trees. He saw his own horse crush one of them underfoot, an unfortunate man who went down without a single word. A sword slash opened the throat of a soldier to his right, before the man could swing his own blade, and blood fountained out. And then everything was moving fast again. Men screamed in pain, bones crunched, and steel rang to steel. Logan struck at several men with his blade, but all too quickly he was past and riding onward to the path. The rest of his men were busy overriding the enemy behind him. He didn't even need to look to know it was so. It felt good, though it didn't negate the fact that the army hot on their tails was a good deal larger than anyone could have expected. Within moments they were on the path, racing up the side of the cliff. At several points the path was wide enough for only two horses galloping side by side. Any more and they risked someone sliding off and falling to the rocks below. "Come on!" he urged. More arrows shot by him as they reached the top of the bluff. He spun his horse around and for the first time saw exactly what was behind them. The remainder of his 30 men were hot on his heels, and not far behind them were well over 200 soldiers, charging madly across the field. They filled his field of vision, making his heart race with fear. Off their horses, quartered here on the bluff, they were massively outnumbered and could be pegged off by the archers at a distance. "Get under cover!" he shouted, quickly sliding off his horse. There were large rocks up on the ridge which they fell behind. The flights of arrows halted as the commanders below ordered the archers to stop. There was no point while the knights were out of sight. Logan couldn't hear what their next commands were, but he could guess. They were preparing to rush the path up the bluff using their arrows to keep the knights under cover as long as they could. They would suffer losses certainly, but eventually they would break through. They had the numbers. The knight nearest to Logan looked over at him, breathing heavily with exertion. There was fear in the man's eyes. "Are they going to come up here?" he shouted. Logan nodded. "We have what they want, or they think they do." "Then what do we do now?" He tightened the grip on his sword. "We fight." Inwardly he hoped that whatever the rest of Merrick's army did, they came quickly. That was the plan after all, and so far it had worked. Which made Logan all the more nervous as he heard the first cries ring out from below and readied himself for their charge. When the smaller enemy force entered the valley from the north, its commanders, Ferrell the nobleman who was serving their king, or legion though he might be, they had expected to find a rebel force in disarray, possibly in the midst of a full rout. Instead, they found themselves under assault by the bulk of the rebel force. Magical balls of fire landed in their midst, the explosions sending them scattering. Immediately afterward, a giant stone golem was the first to reach their line, great fists swinging and sending men flying in the air. Rebel infantry followed immediately thereafter, shouting their war cry and charging into the line. Merrick was with that infantry, but well enough behind the front line that he wasn't face to face with the enemy. Rowan watched him from further up the hill, her own mounted troops pawing impatiently to enter the fight. Her father had told her to wait, hidden in the trees, until Merrick's force was well and truly engaged before she rode in to attack from the flank. Their only chance was to hit the enemy fast and hard, and hopefully to scatter them in time to reach Logain. If they could catch the enemy at the bluff, they could smash them against the cliffs. They would be caught, unable to rout. It was a long shot. The worry that lined her father's face as he agreed to the plan told her that much. But if the plan had been impossible, he would sooner have clubbed Merrick over the head and dragged him off personally than agreed to it. She could see Merrick shouting orders to the men, urging them forward. He was trying to push through to the front, attempting to join the fight. The men immediately around him pressed close, however, forming a circle. Father would have told them to do that, she assumed. Even though Merrick was wearing a helmet, she could tell he was becoming frustrated as he realized what the soldiers were doing. More magic crackled in the air as a blizzard formed around a large part of the enemy force. They were beginning to retreat back out of the valley and regroup, their commanders becoming frantic, but the ice that was magically forming on the ground beneath their feet was making that difficult. One of the enemy commanders started shouting loudly and pointed at Wilhelm, who was standing on a rock not far beyond Merrick's men. The mage's yellow robes unfortunately made him stand out, as did his exposed position. He needed to see his targets, however, and his range was limited. As arrows began to fly in his direction, he was forced to jump off his rock, his angry swearing so loud even Rowan could hear it from where she stood. A wave of Wilhelm's hand sent the stone golem ponderously charging towards the archers, its fists swinging. That would definitely keep them distracted. It would be close. Rowan couldn't see just how many men there were here, but she figured it likely that at least as many as the rebels did. As soon as they dug in and began to fight back, their offense would be ground to a standstill. Her warhorse whinnied nervously as she patted its head, shushing it gently. One of the riders nearby looked to her, apprehensive. "Where do we charge, my lady? If they back out of the valley, we'll never flank them." "They won't back out completely," she assured him, "but we have to wait." Still, she shared the anxiety. Already she could see signs of the enemy reorganizing and struggling to outflank Merrick's men by racing into the valley proper. Many of them were urged on, in fact, by their desperation to get away from the rage of the golem's fists. It was going much as her father had forecast, but there were more men than the scouts had reported. That meant this would take longer. Even if they were able to defeat this part of the usurper's forces, what would become of Logain? Picking up the reins, she rode over to where her own lieutenant was waiting. A stout woman by the name of Branwyn. The lieutenant was one of the few other women who served with the rebels as a soldier. Rowan knew that many of the men who didn't know either of them well believed that she had promoted Rowan for that reason only, but it wasn't so. The lieutenant was strong and determined, perhaps because she had more to prove. Rowan knew exactly what that was like. "Lieutenant," she called out, "I need to speak to the Earl." Branwyn nodded solemnly. "Any orders, my lady?" "If I'm not back within 20 minutes, charge the flank as planned." Rowan smiled grimly. "I'll trust your judgment on everything else." Branwyn blinked with surprise and her lips thinned, but she otherwise took the unusual order without comment. "Understood, my lady." Rowan spun her horse about and raced out of the trees and down into the valley. She tried to pay little attention to the battle that was still going on, though she did notice that Merrick had at last gotten his wish. The circle of men around him had spread out by the melee, meaning Merrick had engaged. Rowan worried about that, but not as much as her father would have. He had wanted to keep Merrick out of the fight completely. Rowan knew that Merrick was well armored and had a much better swordsman than he would ever admit to. One of the reasons she had worked so hard, after all, was to gain his respect. Ugh, can I talk? Her father's men were waiting on the opposite side of the valley, and it took several minutes of hard riding to reach him. She splashed across the wide but shallow part of the stream, and when she came at the other bank, her father's men were already running out to intercept her. Her father was brought out a moment later, riding out on his own dark stallion, and looking more than a little concerned by the interruption. "What is it?" he asked. "You should be with the horsemen." "There's more men than we thought, father. That means that there might be more coming from the east as well. We need to help Logain." Her father grimaced, sunlight glistening brightly off his silverite armor as he turned back to the soldiers standing just a few feet away. "Go," he waved to them. "I wish to be alone for a moment." His men hesitated, momentarily confused, but they did not question the order. They left. He slowly turned back to her, white brows furrowed with concern. Rowan couldn't tell exactly what he was going to say, but she already understood what he was thinking. She felt her fury rising. "I can see the same things you do," he began. "And I agree. It would be difficult enough to defeat the usurper's men here in the north. But..." He held up a hand. "Merrick's friend has already done his job. We've yet to see any of the eastern forces coming through the valley. He's drawn them all off, and that gives us time to do what we must." "Which is?" she snapped. "Which is," he stated with force, "saving Merrick as well as the army." The Earl stepped closer to Rowan and put his hand on her shoulder. His expression was grim. "Rowan, the moment we drive these men into any kind of retreat, we need to flee the valley with whatever we have left. It's our only chance. Logain is expecting us to reinforce him." "He is expendable." The Earl said the word with unease, but said it even so. Rowan stepped away from her father, frowning deeply. What he said wasn't entirely a surprise, and yet she still felt disappointed. "We gave our word," she protested. "He gave us the plan that is giving you your chance, and you're going to abandon him?" "The part he is playing is his own plan. Her father sighed, "is that of the sacrificial lamb. Perhaps he didn't realize it, but there it is." He took hold of her gauntleted hand firmly, looking her straight in the eyes. "It's a good plan. We must not waste it, for Ferelden's sake." She pulled her hand away and turned her father, but didn't leave. He patted her on the shoulder again. "There are things we must do, things that must be done. To survive, Queen Mora did them, and so shall her son. This Logain is doing a service, and so as are the men with him." She nodded slowly, grimacing. The Earl's hand lingered on her shoulder a moment longer, but whatever else was on his mind, he kept to himself. "Go then," he finally said. "There isn't much time." She didn't look back. When Rowan rejoined her own forces on the other side of the valley, she saw that they were already preparing to ride. Her lieutenant rode toward her, flagging her down. "We were just about to charge," Branwen informed her. "Did you want us to hold off, my lady? What's the situation?" "The prince seemed to be doing well enough so far. He stopped the enemy from encircling him. The wizard is almost an army unto himself." Her attention was then drawn as the sound of horns signaled from down in the valley. Two of the watchmen nearby waved to her, and she nodded in acknowledgment to them. "The Earl is engaging now, my lady." Rowan did not answer right away. The green plume on her helmet fluttered in the breeze as she stared hard at the ground from atop her horse. The sounds of many men shouting and screaming could be fairly loud heard in the distance. Any of them could be Merrick, she thought. "My lady?" her lieutenant asked hesitantly. "No," Rowan stated. She looked up and spun her horse about. "We are reinforcing the bluff now, before it's too late." "But, my lady, what about the prince?" Rowan began to ride forward, her expression firm. "The Maker will watch over him," she muttered solemnly. Then louder to address the startled riders assembled behind her. "All of you, follow me. We ride south." Without waiting for a response, she kicked her warhorse into a gallop and began to head to the valley. Okay, I think I'm going to stop it here, guys. I will continue reading the Chapter 5 on the next part of Reading of the Stolen Throne.